I'm Miwa Messer. I'm the producer and host of Pour It Over, and I have so been looking forward to this conversation with Dana Williams. She is the author of a new book on Toni Morrison, and it's Toni as editor, not author. So we're going to go in all sorts of different directions in this conversation. And I have to say, I was dipping back into Virginia Woolf and William Faulkner because I did not know that Toni Morrison's thesis, graduate school thesis, was on Woolf and Faulkner. I mean, obviously, we all know the body of work that is Toni Morrison's. But at the same time, now I get to see a whole different side of her, thanks to Dana, who is the dean of the graduate school at Howard University and also a professor of African American literature. And I'm so excited to hear all of these stories. This book was such a treat to read. And I know I'm smarter now that I've read it. But Dana, can I ask how the book started for you? Because how do you find the time to do
Yeah, thank you. That's so kind. I really appreciate that. That's a big part of the energy that I tried to use as I was writing early and writing late, because you're right, it was tough to find the time because my work as a faculty member at
it?
Howard and then as dean at Howard, and then I try to do as much as I possibly can for the profession and the humanities, especially with board work. But it was really important work because to some degree, and I feel even a tremendous amount of humility saying it, Morrison trusted me with a story.
Yeah.
And that gave me really the kind of confidence that I needed to be able to write. I started thinking about this project when I was in a graduate seminar with Eleanor Traylor, who is one of Miss Morrison's closest friends. And Dr. Traylor told us we're going to do these novels by contemporary African American writers. And I thought I wanted to read them all, but then I said, well, what do they have in common? Of all of the novels that you could have chosen and short stories or all of the fiction you could have chosen, why these? And she said, well, they're the writers that Morrison edited at Random House. And I thought, what? Like,
Yeah.
back up, tell me more. What do you mean? I had a sense of what an editor was and what an editor did, but then I didn't really think about a contemporary person being the midwife of a generation of writers, if you will. As a lit scholar, I was aware of Jessie Fawcett and the work that she did during the Harlem Renaissance, and somebody really had to curate that work, even as people tend to think about Elaine Locke and the New Negro. But there was a whole kind of system that was happening during the Harlem Renaissance that I thought was dispersed and didn't really gather itself again. And to learn that Toni Morrison really was doing something similar was really fascinating to me. And I thought initially that I would really work on the project thinking about these fiction writers in relation to Morrison as a fiction writer. And then I was at Northwestern at the inaugural Leon Forrest lecture, where Toni Morrison was actually giving the lecture. We're talking about Leon Forrest, and I had done a book on Leon Forrest that was just about to come out. And she gave me this kind of look like, why do you know all of this about Leon Forrest? Even the other people who are in this room who work with Leon Forrest aren't thinking about all of Leon Forrest's novels this way. And then I said, oh, well, I first started to read them in that class where we read the books that you edited as fiction. And she then gave me this kind of knowing look. And when I said, Eleanor Traylor taught the class, and it was like, oh, okay, I get it now. I completely get it. And then so she said, well, that was really hard work. It's really important work, and people don't know a lot about it, and people don't talk about the work as editor as much. If there's anything I can do to help, let me know. Well, that was it. That was all I needed. That was absolutely all I needed. And so the rest, as they say, is history.
I I started reading Morrison as a teenager,
Mhm.
and I mean, obviously foundational for a lot of us, right? Like I had Morrison and Baldwin and Maxine Hahn Kingston happening kind of in a. I was also reading, V.C. Andrews. I'm not going to pretend that I was only doing the really interesting stuff. I was reading
Mhm.
everything. I was reading everything. But when I was flipping through the book before I sort of really sat down to dig in, and you've got an appendix of the books edited by Morrison, I was like,
Mhm.
oh, actually, wait, Tony Cade Bambara and Gail Jones, and I'm so excited about Gail Jones's Renaissance.
Yes.
Gwendolyn Brooks, right? Like the memoir was just reissued by New York Review of Books Classics, and so more people can get access to it now. A lot of writers, and June Jordan too, and I was like, oh, and Angela Davis. I
Yes.
mean, she had celebrities too, but when I think of some of the women who sit sort of very close to my intellectual development and my development as a reader, I'm just like, oh, I didn't think about but now I know. I'm just like, oh, that makes perfect sense.
Yeah, the
They sit in a
connections were really
perfect line.
interesting. Yeah. It was a big part of the work was making the connections
Hmm.
and trying to avoid going down rabbit holes because you wanted to make this connection with this and see
Right.
this. And it was like this kind of really interesting, um, almost like a web that didn't have a single point of entry or a single starting point. They
Right.
were just like this entanglement that was really interesting. Everything from the bookstores, and that's, I think, the work of editors
Yeah.
is really important in that way because that's the place where you connect marketing
Hmm.
to sales, to acquisitions,
Hmm.
to paper sources, because there were periods when paper was expensive, so they had to make decisions about how long something was going to be because the price point couldn't be a certain thing. And we have always thought about writing as a kind of leisure activity and
Hmm.
reading similarly.
Yep.
It's something that you get to do as a special treat of sorts. Like it's not a requirement. So when you think about how all of these things come together and how all of these writers were connected
Hmm.
with each other and the spaces that they were in, it's just fascinating.
I also feel like the Morrison that I met in your book thinks much more like a publisher than just an editor.
Yeah.
She was doing the because the range of books. I mean, sure, I just rattled off some of my favorite names, and really, again, they are also foundational to my development as a reader and as a bookseller. But there there were a couple of business books, there were a couple of anthologies that
Hmm.
were adopted as textbooks, and there's also something called the Black Book, which I want to bring up because for her, and you talk about this quite in depth, there is a 35th anniversary edition that's available, so you don't have to go hunting for. You can actually hold this in your hands and
Yeah.
experience this book, and it's very, very cool. But I want to start there because it's not the first thing I would have thought of in terms of her editorship, but at the same time it really does kind of summarize every single thing she was trying to do in this range of books.
I think so. And it also influences her as a writer
Mm-hmm.
because some of the stories that she picks up a little bit later really come from her work on the Black Book.
Mm-hmm.
And I would agree completely that she's thinking about this from the perspective of a publisher because she was always aware, um, even before it became very obvious, of the transition from the publisher as a person who enabled us to think about things in a kind of luxury, elite, kind of high end way. The shift from that to this is just about money.
Mm-hmm.
This isn't about the art form anymore. So early on, when she's thinking about the Black Book, she's like, I'm tired of hearing these conversations about not being able to sell books on both sides of the street, which essentially meant having to convince the sales team often that Black people were buying books and reading books and like consumers that you really had to think about in terms of a market. So the Black Book gives her the space to be able to do that. And she's also culturally astute enough to know that there has to be like some big celebration of this thing. And the irony of it, of all things, is there is no narrative in the Black Book. It's all images. There are some epigraphs that start different sections, but it essentially tells a story without the words, which makes it completely appealing to everybody. There's
Mm-hmm.
also the familiarity. People see things and they recognize things that they would have seen in their grandmother's homes or things that they had heard about. There's intrigue, there is reminiscence. All of those things are there. And the book sells exceptionally well.
Mm-hmm.
Culturally, she puts it together where there's this big celebration, there's this big party. So the book became an event in and of itself. She
Mm-hmm.
goes and she has radio spots, there are TV spots, and she's also using her growing fame as a writer to promote the book as well. And I think you're right. It captures so many things. It pulls from some of the writers that she had worked with already before the Black Book, and then it also introduces her to ideas that she picks up a little bit later, not just in the novels, but themes that she wants to pick up with other writers a little bit later.
And one of the things that I love though is she's on the road touring behind Sula, which is a novel I
Hmm.
love, but also talking about the Black Book. And the two
Absolutely.
of those projects in juxtaposition, I love that. We can have both.
Yes.
We can have both. You can talk about high low, you can talk about the visuals, we can have both. in the
Yep.
same conversation. And I love that. And then the idea that she finds a piece of the story that inspires Beloved as she's putting this together, I'm like, this to me, books are context. That's part of why I got so much pleasure out of reading Toni at random, because there were so many. I didn't know who Henry Dumas was. Sorry, now I
Mm.
know. I will go back. But I've had this Leon Forrest sitting on my desk, Divine Days, which is not one of the books she edited, but it's 1,000+ pages.
Yes.
It's delightful. It is going to take me a minute to finish said 1,000
Yes.
pages, and I read pretty quickly. But and actually, I had grabbed this book because another writer called Gabriel Bump, who's born in Chicago and has a couple of novels set there, um, he had referenced it, I think, in an Instagram post, and I was like, "Who is this guy? This is really interesting. I should check this out." So that's how I come to books. It's kind of like, well, what are people looking at? What is going to
Yeah.
surprise me? Or I just scheduled an interview with a writer who's got a memoir coming out, but she's also written poetry. And I'm like, okay, time to go hunt for the poetry so I can have a holistic view
Yeah.
of her body of work. She's also a visual artist too. So I'm like, okay, there's a
Wow.
lot happening here. And I'm stoked for the conversation, but this is what's so exciting to me with your work is like you are connecting dots in ways. So how do you though figure out who makes the cut? How do you figure out where you're going to not run down every rabbit hole? Because I you sent me off on rabbit holes, but I had the lecture. I didn't have a book deadline. I had an interview deadline, but I was going down all of the rabbit holes.
It was tough, I will admit. The Leon Forrest, as you
Mhm,
have just mentioned, because I had worked on Leon Forrest
mhm.
before, was a no cut, no question. Like we're keeping conversation about Forrest, but interestingly enough, there were probably I'd say 50 or so pages that I ended up having to trim, like kept the meat, but the context around them. So that in and of
Okay.
itself was tough. But then I think also wanting to tell a story that would, as you mentioned, introduce readers who were thinking about Morrison, or thinking
Hmm.
about Morrison as editor, but to introduce them to all of these like really incredible books that she edited. So as you talked just a bit about the artist who you're about to talk to, it made me think about Barbara Chase-Riboud, who
Right.
was a visual artist who had some fame in that space, but who had no reputation really as a literary person who wrote From Memphis and Peking, a collection of poems that Morrison took a chance on, and then who then gets fame much later by writing the novel Sally Hemings,
Right.
which she had proposed to Toni Morrison as almost like a journal diary. And Morrison says that will never work. It just won't work. And they didn't even argue about it. Morrison was just very clear it won't work. So it ends up working as a novel, as Morrison had suggested in the beginning.
Yep.
So it's an interesting thing to think about a person who has that kind of foresight,
Hmm.
in part because she's read so much and she's
Right.
also attuned to what the reading audience is kind of craving, just paying attention to what people are thinking about and what they may be interested in.
She's also in a position though at a house where she has more leeway,
Yes.
I think, than other folks. I do think, at least as it's described in your book, that she was in a position. Now, she wasn't given the biggest budgets, so of course there's a caveat that goes with all of it. But she was very, very smart about keeping her fingers. I mean, it's a cliche for a reason, right? But she has her fingers on the pulse. She's doing everyone from Huey Newton and Muhammad Ali to, Gwendolyn Brooks, who is rising at the time, but she also discovers Gail Jones, right? I
Yes.
mean, like, and it's so delightful to see all of this new work coming out. I mean, you and I are taping in 2025, and I think Gail Jones went from having nothing for 20 years, and
To,
now pretty regularly, there's been like a book a year. It's been great. It's,
yep. And that was one of the things, as you were saying, like with the Jones around rabbit holes, if you will. So
mhm.
Palmares, which came out before,
Yep.
I then start to think I want to go look at the manuscript that Morrison was working on
Right.
when her relationship with Gail Jones is severed,
Hmm.
um, to figure out whether or not it's the same book and like whether the notes are there. And I think like that's not your project. Morrison didn't edit the book. It's not your project, but I certainly want to know. And I'm
Uh-huh.
glad to see that I'm sorry, that Gail Jones is having this kind of resurgence. We know that she had volumes and volumes of work
Yep.
very early on, but just really went through a crisis
Hmm.
personally. So, and I'm thinking it's Lucille Clifton. I'm wondering if it's Lucille Clifton that you're thinking about.
Oh,
Yep, and not Gwendolyn
Yep,
Brooks
sorry.
because no
Yes.
problem. But Lucille Clifton too is really one of those writers who is at the center of all things Black women poetry.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Just amazing as a figure, delightful as a person. And Morrison had the opportunity to work with her on two books.
Right.
Um, but similarly, as we were talking about as a publisher, Morrison was clear that it would be tough to keep her at Random House if Random House didn't give her much more attention. It's just really tough because the market, as she would tell people all the time, including Toni K. Bambara, the market is geared up for novels. People will commit to novels. Like poetry just doesn't sell nearly as well. It doesn't make the house nearly as much money. But I think the tide has changed a little bit on
Mm-hmm.
that, particularly when you have a lot of work and you can do these volumes together,
Mm-hmm.
so that people can get a big book full of really great poetry.
I also need both just as a reader. There are
Yeah.
times where I need to sit with language. I have that giant Lucille Clifton collected poems, and it's like 4 inches thick, and it's a delight because you just dip in and out kind of thing.
Yep.
Um, but at the same time, I think there are people who feel like poetry is so much more formal that than in some cases it actually is. Like if you really sit with some of the work that's out there, it's kind of like, well, actually, you don't, you can just play with the images. And so much of sort of the thread that I'm seeing in the work that Morrison edited is the language. It's not just using the vernacular, but it's the imagery, it's the unexpected in
Mm-hmm.
some ways. I mean, there's a consistency and a vision, like an overall vision
Mm-hmm.
to the body of work that she's helping put out there, um, that it's really exciting to see.
I think so. I'm thinking about the attention to language that you mentioned with
Mm.
the poetry.
Hmm.
Just I mean, it seems like a kind of sort of small thing, but when she's editing Lucille Clifton and she's going through the poems and she tells her, like, all of the poems are great, but there are a couple of things that I think you should adjust. Even like on the one hand, there's the title where she
Yeah,
says, like, hey, there are 180 Black woman
yeah.
titles. Let's title this something else. But then there is a stanza that she says, you take the poem out of its kind of timelessness by putting in a particular place. And she talks about a specific word. I'm gonna like, let's see if I can find it really
Yeah,
quickly.
yeah.
She says, Clifton shifted the first line of the title in this poem, I Am Not Done Yet, and dropping the conjunction and
Yep.
beginning the poem with as possible as yeast, as imminent as bread. So they were literally talking about conjunctions, like the
Yep.
language. And then she says, by the way, the poem to Miss Anne worked marvelously. Quote, but please delete the fourth verse. You don't need it. The three other images are thunderous and should not lead up to Little Rock Spit. The other verbs are watched, walked, handed, very civilized, very poisonous, spit, well, no. I mean, she's talking
Yeah.
about words,
Yep.
like literal, just like this word doesn't work. Putting this in this context has its challenges. And like, watch what the other words and
Hmm.
images are doing. They're thunderous. They do this particular work and then they lead up to like this thing that brings them down. So there is this accessibility that's there, but there's also this precision of language that I think is there.
I think too, it's easy to forget that great editing means you don't see the seams.
That's right.
You just don't see the seams. And I think we've all had that moment where you're just like, well, that was a perfect book, right? Regardless of what it, we've all experienced the thing that we
Hmm.
think of as the perfect book. And I'm like, well, that's an editor who did their job. I mean,
That's right.
that relationship is so, your editor is your first advocate. Your editor is the person, all of this kind of thing. And the relationships she had with her writers. I mean, the way she talks about editing Toni Cade, Bambara, in a way, is totally different from what you just described. And
Yeah.
she's just like, well, you got to use a light touch with Toni because, and
If
I,
you pull one thing out, the whole
uh,
thing falls apart.
uh-huh.
Yeah.
And I mean, I'm used to seeing things in different iterations. I mean, I might get something really early with the full idea that there will be some tweaks, there will be some things. And what I like to say to publishers is always, I just need words on the page.
Hmm.
I don't need the actual perfect thing. I need words on the page. I know it's going to evolve.
That's
right.
right.
But I need to get a
Yeah,
feel for the thing. And I'm not saying I get things before they're fully edited. I'm just, things change, stuff changes.
mhm.
It doesn't,
I think that's so crucial though to think about for writers. I think if there were one big takeaway that I would take for writers is like get the thing on the page. It doesn't have to be perfect. Like our tendency is to
right.
labor over the sentence until we get it perfectly. And that's fine after you have gotten the idea on the page. But you can't get the sentence perfectly if the idea isn't there. We're like that's a stall tactic. Yeah.
But I do think that there might be folks who aspire to be writers who don't really have a full picture of how primary and important that relationship is,
Yeah.
and that you have to be able to hand something over. I mean, everyone needs an editor, and there are a couple of writers who I know later in their careers were kind of like, no, I'm good, and I'm like, no, really,
You need an editor. Toni
really,
Morrison kept an editor.
everyone, it's just to have that place to play, right? Even if something is a somber topic, I mean, you still need space to play with the language. You need space to play with the ideas. You need space to be able to say, "Hey, wait a minute." I mean, and you even quote Morrison doing the same thing, where she's saying, "Well, sometimes it's restrictive, and sometimes you have to set things loose." It's just there isn't. Yes, grammar is grammar, but it's not. It has to be more fluid. It has
That's
to
right.
speak to the actual project itself,
Hmm.
and part of that comes from the relationship between the author and the editor.
I agree. I think one of the reasons that Morrison preferred to work with her writers in person was for that
Hmm.
very reason, because the energy is just a little bit different. There were times, obviously, when she couldn't have certain conversations with people in person, but she preferred the phone if it could not be in person. But fortunately for me, as a writer who's in the archive, there is lots of correspondence. And I did
Hmm.
have the benefit of like having interviews with Miss Morrison to be able to follow up and say, hey, I didn't quite get where this was going, or what was the source of this, or give me some backstory.
Hmm.
And even with Toni Cade Bambara, for instance, I panicked because there's this period where there's no correspondence, and I go to Spellman's archives to see
Hmm.
if I can find it on the Toni Cade Bambara side. And I go to Miss Morrison and I say, like, how all the conversation just stopped? Like, what happened? I can't tell this story. And she's like, oh, she was living with me then. So that had everything to do with, again, the way that the relationship worked, because
Right.
Bambara was a short story writer.
Hmm.
No question, hands down. But Morrison has to coax her into writing the novel
Yep.
because that's where she could get a bigger advance. There was where she could sell more books. And of course, Morrison knew that there was this really interesting story to tell. And she also was clear that she didn't want to be the only writer who
Hmm.
people were talking about. Like it could be the both and, as you mentioned
Yeah,
before.
yeah.
But Toni K. Bambara had serious reservations about
Mhm.
understanding how novels worked. Like she's like, it's as though I haven't read one. I don't know how this works. So as her editor,
Right.
Morrison was very kind and very gentle. And instead of saying, you've been writing, this is your third book, like, what are you doing? What are you talking about?
Right.
They just, let's just take some time and let's talk through this and let's figure out what this work process is
Hmm.
like. And then let's talk about what the edit would look like. And
Right.
Morrison would talk about like, I'm sitting there and I'm giving her feedback
Hmm.
and I'm looking around at the walls trying to figure out what I'm going to have for dinner. And she's back that quickly, having fixed whatever it is. It took me forever to articulate was the thing that needed. And she's like, got it, go up, come back down. So that really is that kind of intimate relationship between an author and an editor that you know could not have
Right.
happened otherwise.
And then what we get on the other side of it, though, are these amazing, enduring works. And a lot of the
Yeah.
reviews, when Gorilla My Love first came out, the story collection, there was a lot of, oh, look at the vernacular. This is, and some of the reviews got it immediately, and they were just absolutely, really, really great. Walker Walker Percy nominates Gorilla My Love for the National Book Award in 1973, which
Yes.
delights me to no end. I'm like, that's a pairing I really now I want to go back and reread The Moviegoer.
I know there are all of these little things you're like,
Right?
huh. And
It's
even thinking about the times and how book awards work and
mm-hmm.
why a writer gets in that mix, like all of
Yeah.
those things are things that, yeah, we do begin to pursue where we go like, huh, this is fascinating. What's this
I
person's sensibility that made this attractive to them?
Puts me right back with Virginia Woolf and William Faulkner. Was not
Yeah.
really expecting that. But again, American literature was not considered a serious graduate school
Right.
program in the 60s.
Right.
And I'm kind of like, huh, that's a little bit of it. Like the modernists were just not a thing. And I'm like, huh. But I want to come back to vernacular for a second because it is something that we still see even now, right?
Hmm.
This is 40 years after Gorilla My Love, or roughly 40 years after Gorilla My Love, close to 50. And we're still having conversations about grammar and vernacular and how expression happens on the page.
Yeah.
And can I diagram a sentence? Yeah, I probably can still diagram a
That's
sentence.
right.
Do I really need to know how to diagram a sentence? I do not. Do I know a writer who has a diagram sentence on his? Yes, I do. However, it's useful to have, but I think language, we need to push language. We need to make language evolve. We need language to actually represent who we are and what we're doing. And if it's shocking to you, it might not be because of the language.
Yeah. I agree. I think we do need all of the tools available to us
Hmm.
to try to express the fullness of humanity in relation to creation.
Hmm.
And we see that happen with all of the different writers that she is in touch with,
Hmm.
from this moment where she says, I want to make sure that Huey P. Newton and the Panthers are seeing their best possible light. She's like, even the stuff that's been published already needs an edit,
Hmm.
because the idea evolution is there that I want to help to make clear. From that extreme to just being very deliberate about her work with Ivan Van Sertima, who has command of language and the vernacular in a particular way, but he's also making this relatively controversial argument at the time
Hmm.
that she's trying to pull him back from some of the vernacular that works in ways um, that we don't expect. So the review, when They Came Before Columbus comes out, for instance, not quite vernacular, but you still see what's happening rhetorically,
Right.
is bad news for Columbus.
Ugh.
So really trying to figure out how we can use language to tell stories in ways that people feel that they can receive, but that also people that makes people feel like incredibly familiar. Henry Dumas is another example
Hmm.
of the way that language works in a way, that first, or the lead story in Ark of Bones, where literally um, the main character talks about needing a witness
Hmm.
to experience and to be able to articulate, to tell the story after this person is gone. Or what Leon Forrest does with language in There's a Tree More Ancient Than Eden, when one of the things that I thought was really funny, she said, Leon, this tree must be significantly pruned. Like for the for the book, there is a tree more ancient than Eden. Yes, but the tree doesn't need to be this. Like this is going too far. And really trying to use language to paint images and create sequence, and to think about it from different disciplinary perspectives. With Bambara, she thought like this is this camera eye. Bambara is watching us,
Hmm.
or we're watching the story that Bambara is painting for us. To think very specifically, though, just the
Hmm.
best example I can think about the vernacular is the line in Raymond's Run in the short story collection Gorilla My Love, where Hazel says, she's so fast, she just might come in first, second, and third place.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Hmm. Which I have actually used that line a couple of times recently because sometimes it's really helpful.
Yeah.
No, you were making me think though, also about vernacular when Toni Cade Bambara herself was saying, "I'm not thinking this as anything special. I'm just representing what I know."
Yeah.
And I think that's a really important idea for any reader to hold, right? We each bring our own experience to whatever we're reading. And I mean, certainly there is stuff. YA was not quite a thing when I was coming up. There was a very limited sort of so you end up punching above your weight really quickly.
Hmm.
And I'm sure there was stuff the first time I read it, I had no idea what planet I was on, but it was like the words, this is beautiful, right? And
Yeah.
you're like, oh, I would like more of this. And then of course, you get a little smarter and then you realize some stuff doesn't reread well and
Yeah.
you can move on from that.
Or the opposite, which is, whoa, I got the first layer of this. I had
And
no
now,
idea these other layers were even
yep,
happening because I was just too young. Yeah.
yep,
Those
yep.
are fun.
But to get this holistic view of Morrison, right, both as reader, because she's pulling in her own experience of what she's been reading,
Hmm.
to advise and edit and help create some really significant work. And then to see sort of how some of it flows back. I mean, I spent some time with her early work and the introductions that she's
Hmm.
written, and
Yeah.
to see that dotted line. And I realize this book is about her as editor, but she does have this incredibly holistic approach to words and the work, whether it's hers or one of her authors. And yet, I don't ever feel like she's shaping someone else's work only to fit her vision. She's shaping it to put a better piece of work into the world. And I
I
think
think
that's
so.
really cool.
I agree. I kept asking, what would you say is a Morrison aesthetic as an editor? And I get that's me
Hmm.
insisting on there being something neat that I can tie up in a bow. I get
Right.
that. I was resistant to even asking the question, but I kept saying, no, no, no. Like, there's got to be something. Like, you had to have some formula, or you had to have, she kept saying, no, it varies from author to author. It varies from book to book.
Hmm.
And it's, and she said, all right, since you're insisting, in the same way that every book I wrote, I wrote because I thought I was the best person to write it. You know, the kind of adage that she has become famous for, like, if there is a book you want to read, write it.
Yep.
He thought, I want this book, any book that I edited, to be impossible except for this writer and except for this editing. Like, the book doesn't exist in the same way. It might be there in the world. Otherwise, the topic might be there, but every writer, there had to be something about what this writer was bringing to this experience that only they could bring. And I wanted it to be something that only I could bring as editor. Like, that was my work. And I mean, I didn't have a choice, right? But I was like, okay, I can see that. There is no do these 5 things first formula. It varies from person to person, but it has to be there's something I can bring to this uniquely. That's my job, to find what can I bring to this that no one else could.
It's that vision,
Yeah.
right? Like it's that vision. Can I ask you, I heard you tell a story where you were perhaps helped along, but the way you tell the story is really fantastic. But it's a conversation between you and Dr. Morrison where she gives you some guidance. Can I ask you to tell that story here? Because I think
Absolutely.
it does represent exactly the kind of thing that you're talking about, where she's like, listen, I am going to help you,
Yeah.
but.
But that's right. So, and there were times too, like when we would do the interviews, you could tell that she was like completely in, she's engaged,
Mhm.
she's excited. And then there are other times where it was like, ma'am, it's almost time. Like, it's time for you to get out of my office.
Right.
My mind's on something else.
Hmm.
And I had the benefit, because she and Dr. Traylor were such close friends, to have some informal interaction as well. And there was this open house. Like, Dr. Traylor always has folks over for her house for New Year's Day. We go up, and so she sends me upstairs for something. And Traylor is, had been my dissertation advisor. We're since we maintain a very close relationship. So she too, like, had this kind of humorous way of playing games with me, right? that So she sends me upstairs because she knows that I'm not making as much progress on the book by then. I'm chair of the department and I'm feeling guilty that I'm not writing. And there's like this deep kind of abiding sadness. So she says, oh, go upstairs and get something, like whatever it was. I go upstairs, top of the stairs, hit the right, and it's Toni Morrison sitting in the chair in what we call the red room. And I'm like, this lady knows I have been avoiding Toni Morrison for the last however many months because I have not made as much progress on this book. And when we would see each other, she's like, so how's it going? And the first time you can say, well, it's a little bit slower. And the second time you can go, oh, okay. But after a certain point, you're embarrassed.
Hmm.
So I'm thinking like, oh my God, I cannot
Hmm.
believe this. But we had an earlier conversation where we talked about titles and how hard titles are, what the cover means. And this is in her role as editor,
Hmm.
why she changed so many titles. Like, seeing the cover gives what you're trying to do as the editor is to convince someone to pick up a book.
Hmm. Hmm.
Because if they pick it up, they may look in the index and they may look at the table of contents and then they may buy it, right? Because at the end of the day, that's just trying to get people to buy the book. So I'm proud because I have a title and I say, well, I have a title. And
Hmm.
I'm like really making a big, I'm like, are you ready? She says, okay. And I say, the house that Toni built at random. Because I'm being cute. You know, it's Random House. It's Toni
Mm-hmm.
Morrison. It's the house
Mm-hmm.
that Toni built at random. I thought it's
Mm-hmm.
just pitch perfect. And she looks and she says, too long. So now I'm shattered because I had like my one victory. My one victory is here. And now this victory is gone. And I go, huh, like to myself, like, no, it's not too long. No, it is okay. And she says, Toni at random. And I say, Toni at random. And then we just keep repeating it to figure out, like, does it work?
Mm-hmm.
Does it fit? And we say, and eventually we're like kind of synchronized where we say Toni at random, Toni at random, Toni at random. And so that's how I got edited by Toni Morrison on my own title. And then, by the end of the conversation, I think it's like pitch perfect. I think this is why you're the editor and I'm the not the writer. Like I spin it to make it work for me in every way. And then I was concerned that I would have to compromise on the title, like with the team, because with the marketing team, because it's
Mm-hmm.
an insider's title. Like who knows who is Toni and what
Mm.
is random and why is she at random? But we had this vision of like if people see the picture of Toni Morrison, they'll
Mm-hmm.
know. They won't know at Random House. And then
It's a
my own
beautiful
editor like gave
jacket.
me the end of the title.
This
So
is
thank
so
you.
good.
We worked really, really hard on
It's
that
so
jacket.
good.
Yeah.
It's
So,
beautiful.
and it felt like really good to feel like, all right, we got a title, we have it.
Mm-hmm.
So then it really did come to life. And I agreed completely that giving the book a name made it real in a different way. So,
Yeah. Yeah. Can we talk about you as a reader for a second? Not as a
sure.
scholar, not as a researcher, though I do appreciate both of those pieces of you, but you as a reader. I mean, you don't suddenly wake up one morning and say, I'm going to study literature without having some sort of, idea at the back of your brain that words and books and ideas are a thing you really want to be part of. So, can we talk about Dana and coming into reading and sort of what made you realize that this is a thing?
Yeah, I don't remember not reading. That's
Yeah.
how much reading was a part of my world.
Hmm.
My parents were both educators. My father eventually, he talked my mother in allowing him to pursue his own dreams. But I grew up in a really small town,
Hmm.
and you were either a teacher, a doctor, a nurse, a lawyer. That was
Hmm.
it. My father wanted to be an architect.
Oh, wow.
But there was no path to that, particularly where he did his undergraduate work. So he did math and science as a major, and then he took an apprenticeship of sorts with a contractor. And so he wanted to build houses, and that's what he wanted to do. But he was reading voraciously all the time. And in part because he had to self-teach. So then he talks to my mom and they're like, okay, like I've stopped teaching school for a couple of years. Can I do this business thing for a while? And if it works, it works. If not, I'll go back to teaching school. So they do it. So that kind of impulse, I think, informs me in terms of my impulse as a reader. Like I can teach myself anything because there are books in the world. So then I just became like a voracious reader. Like anything I was curious about, I would read. By the time I got to eighth grade, we were talking about diagram and synthesis. I found it fascinating. There was a system. So I'm like, all right, I appreciate words. I appreciate knowing that there is a system to this. And then every time someone gave me a recommendation for a book, I would actually read it and then I wanted to talk to them about it. And by the time I got to Grambling as an undergraduate, I thought I was going to do law school, maybe, I started as a computer science major, interestingly enough, but I was like trying to do everything else because to me, reading was just what you did.
Right, right,
It
right,
wasn't
right.
a career path per se. And I remember literally asking my mother, I said, like, I feel like this is the most natural thing. Like, am I supposed to do the thing that I do all the time as my career choice? And she basically said, well, I was wondering when you were going to come around to that kind of reality, that that is your career choice. I quickly switched my major to English and I was like as happy as a lark. And I was the person in the class who probably annoyed my peers because I was reading everything early and
Mhm.
like, oh yeah, and that's great. And this is this. So I have always been a reader of all things, from like magazines to chick lit to, I went through the street lit phase with
Mm-hmm.
everybody. Even now, my cheat between semesters is like, I'm gonna read a John Grisham book if it's out. I'm gonna read the Alex Cross series. I'm gonna read Avery King series by Stacey Abrams. So I was like so into Selena Montgomery
Mm-hmm.
before
Uh-huh.
she became Stacey Abrams. I was like, this is just smart. But the flip of it is I'm gonna read Howard French's Second Emancipation because I'm thinking about history and I'm thinking about like just what's happening in the world, reading books about the life of the mind. So I will pretty much read anything, although my favorite still is fiction. Like a good novel makes me happy.
I'm right
Good
there with you.
poetry makes me pretty happy, but a good novel, and I'm
A,
content.
a good novel. I mean, there's a reason sometimes too we talk about nonfiction that reads like fiction, right? Because we're talking about the pacing, we're talking about
Yeah,
the experience and the just being immersed in the story, right? But yeah, a good novel is, oh, it's a
yeah.
treat. And I love a story collection, but I really love a novel.
Yeah, you're right. A good short story collection, I think, is important. The interesting thing for me, because I had done all academic presses before, this was my
Hmm.
first press trade or mass market book, being mindful of, because it doesn't even occur to me that I'm thinking about these terms as something that are second nature because I have done this work on Morrison. So I try to explain what I mean by like the trade book. But it was quite similar in terms of my experience where I said, like, it's as if I've never read nonfiction before, that I don't know how to write nonfiction. I only know how to write like a book as an article for a peer-reviewed journal.
Right.
And it was that moment where I said, this nonfiction is supposed to read like fiction. There's supposed to be ups and downs. I'm
Hmm.
supposed to want the reader to turn the page. So that was something of a challenge that I didn't even recognize that I do with storytelling, but had never given myself permission to do on the page. On the page, I was supposed to be this kind of straight laced academic. And so to get to tell this story in a way that I would tell it like, girl, did you know?
Hmm.
That kind of thing was fun. It made the work fun and it made it it made it feel a little bit less like this work that I have to do, you know?
Right. That actually sounds like the perfect place to end. So I'm going to say, Dana Williams, thank you so much for joining us on Poured Over. Toni at Random is out now.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Thank you for listening. Poured Over is a Barnes & Noble production. To help other readers find us, please rate and review the show wherever you listen to podcasts.